There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a crowd when they have agreed, collectively and without speaking, to pretend that what they are watching is not happening. Cale Morrow had grown up in the port city of Dusk's Landing, where slave auctions happened every third Thursday of the month in the square behind the harbormaster's office. He had walked past that square 2,000 times. He had learned, the way children learn the things adults do not wish to teach them directly, that the correct way to pass an auction block was quickly, with your eyes aimed slightly to the left of whatever was actually happening. He was 28 years old the morning he stopped walking quickly. The morning he forgot to aim his eyes slightly left. It was raining. That felt important later, though he could never have said why. A gray, indifferent rain that turned the cobblestones dark and made the torches along the square gutter and hiss. The kind of rain that made the whole world feel like an apology for something it hadn't done yet. The auction had already been going for an hour. He could tell by the crowd. The casual browsers had retreated under awnings, leaving only the serious buyers clustered near the block itself, their cloaks dark with water, their expressions carrying the flat professional interest of men who purchased livestock. Cale had no business being there at all. He was a cartographer's apprentice, third year, with 17 copper coins in his purse and a commission to deliver a set of coastal charts to a shipping company on Merchants Row before noon. He had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The rain, he told himself later. The rain had confused him. He saw her because she was the only person in the entire square who was not trying to be invisible. Most of the enslaved people on the block had mastered the particular art of making themselves small. Not physically, you cannot make a human body smaller than it is, but something in the eyes, something in the set of the shoulders, a careful evacuation of the self that left only a surface, a thing to be evaluated without the discomfort of encountering a person. Cale had seen it before, that deliberate blankness, and it always made something in his chest hurt in a way he did not have words for. The orc woman was not doing that. She stood at the far end of the block, set apart from the others by a cage of iron bars that looked like it had been reinforced recently. The welds were still bright silver against the older rust-dark metal. She was tall. Even with the cage reducing her to a crouch, she was clearly tall and broad, with the kind of musculature that came not from labor but from war. Her skin was the deep green of forest moss after rain, marked across the left forearm and the line of her jaw with the faded silver of old scars. Her hair was black and cropped close on one side, longer on the other, braided with something dark and small that might have been iron beads. But it was her expression that stopped him. She was not blank. She was not afraid or not obviously so. She was looking at the crowd the way a general looks at a map, systematically, strategically cataloging. Her eyes, dark amber under heavy brows, moved from face to face with the patience of someone who has survived by learning to read rooms. When they reached Cale, standing at the edge of the square in his wet wool apprentice's cloak, they stopped. He expected her to look away. That was what people did. They looked, and then they looked away because holding the gaze of an enslaved person felt like an accusation of something. She did not look away. Neither did he. He was not sure how long they stood like that. Long enough for the auctioneer to cycle through 3 other sales. Long enough for the rain to soak through his collar and run cold down the back of his neck. Long enough for something to shift inside him, some careful calculus that he'd been running unconsciously for 28 years, the one that kept tallying up the costs of doing anything versus the costs of doing nothing, and arriving every time at the comfortable answer that nothing was safer. The calculus changed. He did not understand why. Later he would spend a great deal of time trying to reconstruct the logic of the decision, to find the rational through-line that explained why a cartographer's apprentice with 17 copper coins and a chart delivery due at noon walked toward an auction block instead of away from it. He never found one. Some decisions are not made by the thinking part of the mind. Some decisions are made by the part that exists below thought, the part that is just the bare animal fact of being alive, and that part of Cale Morrow had looked at the orc woman in the iron cage and arrived at a conclusion his brain was still 3 steps behind. He walked toward the block. The auctioneer was a short man with an extravagant mustache and the voice of someone who had spent decades projecting across noise and distance. He wore a red vest that had once been impressive. His name, as Cale would learn later, was Pendle, and he had been running auctions in Dusk's Landing for 30 years and had never once, in all that time, thought of himself as doing anything wrong. That detail would bother Cale for a long time afterward. The completeness of Pendle's innocence. The orc woman had been listed, on the placard nailed to her cage, simply as Lot 47. Orc female. Dangerous. Fighter. Reduced for quick sale. Underneath, in smaller letters, previous owners, 3. Reason for resale, unmanageable. Cale stood at the edge of the block and read the placard 3 times. Then he looked at the orc woman, who was looking back at him with the same systematic evaluation she had been applying to everyone else, though now there was something slightly different in it. Question, maybe, or the ghost of one. What happened to the previous owners? He asked. Not the auctioneer. Her. The crowd near him went briefly, pointedly quiet. The orc woman's expression did not change. When she spoke, her voice was low and precise, with an accent that clipped the consonants and lengthened the vowels. An accent Cale could not place, but that sounded like distance, like somewhere very far away and very long ago. The first one, I broke his collarbone when he tried to put a branding iron on me. The second. She paused, and something moved behind her eyes, something dark and controlled. The second, I did not survive in a way that satisfies me to discuss. The third decided I was more trouble than I was worth and sold me here. She tilted her head, fractionally. Why do you ask? He did not have an answer ready. I'm not sure, he said. I think I just wanted to hear you use your own voice. The silence stretched. Then, very quietly, she said, My name is Vraska, in case that's your next question. Vraska, he repeated. Cale Morrow. She looked at him for another long moment. Her jaw was set. There was nothing in her expression that could be called hope. It had been pressed flat by too much experience. But there was something else. Tension. Real attention, the kind that had not entirely given up on the possibility that the world could still occasionally surprise you. The auctioneer, who had been watching this exchange with professional patience, cleared his throat. If you're interested in lot 47, sir, starting bid is 40 silvers. 40 silvers was 2 months of Cale's apprenticeship wages. He had 17 copper. He thought of the charts in the satchel on his shoulder, hand-drawn, meticulously accurate, representing 40 hours of work by his master and 12 hours of his own. He thought of the shipping company on Merchants Row, who was expecting them by noon. He thought of his master, who would be looking for him by evening. He thought about all the sensible, rational, correctly prioritized things that should be occupying his attention right now. Then he thought about Vraska saying, My name is Vraska, in that voice, that flat, careful voice that was holding something behind it like a dam holds water. I don't have the money, he said, but I know where to get it. Can you hold her until midday? The auctioneer's mustache twitched. For a fee, of course. He was already walking. He didn't entirely know where, but his feet seemed to have a plan even if his brain was still catching up. The shipping company on Merchants Row was called Talverin and Sons, and the sons, both of them, were deeply unpleasant men who had inherited their father's business along with his tendency to speak to people in the tone normally reserved for malfunctioning furniture. Cale had delivered charts to them before. He did not like them. He did not think they were good people. He sold them the charts for 3 times the commission price. He did this by walking through their door, unrolling the charts on their table, and saying, These are the most accurate coastal soundings of the Vethra Passage that exist in this city. My master spent the better part of a year on these surveys. You know what they're worth. I need twice the agreed commission, and I need it in the next 20 minutes. The sons had stared at him. The elder son had said, The agreed price is the agreed price. Cale had looked at him steadily and said, You know the Harrier's ledge that claimed 2 of your ships last autumn? These charts show a navigable channel around it on the northern side. Nobody else knows it exists. So, twice the price, or I take these charts to Dockmaster Farron, who has been looking for an excuse to license a second shipping company for years, and who will pay me triple and use the channel to undercut you by spring. He had no idea if this was true. He had looked at the charts when he was rolling them for delivery and noticed the channel, and noted that it would indeed be useful, and thought nothing more of it. Now he was betting that bluffing with accurate information was close enough to not lying that he could live with himself afterward. The sons conferred. Then they gave him 60 silvers and asked him to leave. He left. He ran most of the way back to the square. Vraska was still in the cage. The rain had stopped. She was sitting on the floor of the cage now, cross-legged, which required a considerable act of geometry given her height, and she was braiding one of the leather cords from her boot into something small and intricate. She did not look up when he arrived. She had the look of someone who had trained herself not to watch doors. "I have the money," Cale said. She looked up then. Something crossed her face too quickly for him to read. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality she wore like armor. 42 silvers, he said to the auctioneer, who had materialized immediately. +8 for the holding fee and whatever the standard transfer paperwork costs. 52 silvers total, the auctioneer confirmed, already producing the documents. Cale paid. He signed things. He received. Vraska stood. She had to unfold herself from the cage in stages, and even so she had to duck through the door, and when she was fully upright she was taller than anyone else in the immediate vicinity by half a head. The crowd gave her a reflexive amount of space. She stood for a moment in the open air, breathing slowly, her eyes moving across the square in what Cale was already beginning to recognize as her threat assessment pattern. Then she looked at him. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that Cale felt in his sternum. "What do you want?" she said, "from this?" It was not a question the way most questions are questions. It was the flat demand of someone who had learned that kindness was always a transaction, and that it was better to know the price up front. He thought about lying. He thought about saying something reassuring and vague that would allow both of them to avoid the uncomfortable truth that he had no coherent answer. He was not, it turned out, capable of doing that. Not with her looking at him that way. "Nothing," he said. "I mean, I don't know. I saw you and I couldn't walk away. That's not an answer, I know that. But it's what I have." She looked at him for another long moment. Her expression was illegible in a way that he would come to understand was deliberate. Not blank, but controlled, each reaction considered before it was permitted to reach the surface. Then she said, "You realize that document doesn't mean anything to me. If I chose to walk in that direction," she tilted her head toward the harbor, "and board the first ship leaving this city, there is nothing you could do to stop me." "I know," he said. "So why are you here?" "Because you deserve to make that choice without someone else having already made it for you." Another pause, a different quality to it. She said, "You talk like a person who has spent a lot of time with books and not very much time with people." He said, "That's entirely accurate." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Not anything as simple as that. But a slight recalibration, as though he had said something that was not what she expected, and she was deciding what to do with the information. "The harbor," she said finally. "Show me the harbor. I want to see what ships are leaving." He showed her the harbor. She did not board any of the ships. He did not ask her why. Cale's master was a woman named Essicorder, who was 63 years old, had been married twice and widowed twice and had opinions about both experiences, and who had been making maps for 40 years with the meticulous passion of a person who believed that the most important thing you could do in a world full of confusion was to accurately document where things were. She kept her shop on a narrow street called Brackett Lane, between a chandler's and a bookbinder, and she lived in the 3 rooms above it with her cat, her apprentice, and her considerable archive of charts. When Cale arrived back at Brackett Lane that afternoon with Vraska walking behind him, Essicorder was in the doorway of the shop eating an apple and watching the street with the expression of a woman who has been expecting something unexpected and is mildly gratified to see it finally arrive. She looked at Vraska for a long time. Then she looked at Cale. "How much did you spend?" she said. 52 silvers. "Where did you get 52 silvers?" "I sold the Talvern charts for 3 times the commission." Essa chewed apple. "You know I'm going to have to renegotiate our whole relationship with Talvern now." "I know. I'm sorry. Are you?" He thought about it. "No." Essa looked at Vraska again. Her eyes were the sharp, assessing kind that belonged to someone who had spent decades making visual observations and recording them accurately. She said to Vraska, "What's your name?" "Vraska. Where are you from?" Vraska's jaw tightened fractionally. "Originally, the Eastern Reach. Clan Urath." The tightening said clearly, "That is as much of that as I will give you." Essa nodded as though this was a complete answer. She looked back at Cale. "The spare room is being used for chart storage. You'll have to move the coastal surveys into the studio if she's going to sleep there." Kale blinked. Vraska said, flatly, I don't require charity. I know you don't, Essa said. You'll earn it. I've been meaning to hire another set of hands for the survey work. Do you have any literacy in the common tongue? Vraska said, 7 languages, 2 of which you've probably never heard of. Essa raised an eyebrow in what Kale recognized as genuine approval. Good. Can you hold a precision instrument without breaking it? Vraska looked at her hands. When I choose to. That'll do. Essa stepped back from the doorway. Come in, then. Both of you. There's soup on and I've made too much of it again. This was how it began. The spare room was small and smelled of paper and old wood and the particular dusty intimacy of stored knowledge. Kale moved the coastal surveys into the studio in 3 trips, reorganizing the stacks into a system that he told himself was logical and that Essa would tell him later was chaos dressed up in the appearance of logic. He found an extra blanket. He found a pillow that had seen better decades. He knocked over a stack of charts and caught most of them. Vraska stood in the doorway of the spare room and looked at it for a long moment. You don't have to stay, Kale said. I meant what I said. This is your choice. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, my people have a word. Gavith. It means a place that is not home but where you can put down a weight for a while. The closest your language gets is shelter. But that is not quite right. Gavith, he repeated. She looked at him. Not quite home. Just a place to put the weight down. He said, you can put the weight down here. She said nothing more. But she stepped through the doorway. And she did not leave. The first days were careful. The way 2 people are careful when they are in close quarters and they are not sure of each other's edges. Not unkind, exactly, but precise, measured, giving each other the exact amount of space they seem to need without needing to negotiate it. Essa moved through this carefully like a ship's navigator through shoal water, treating Vraska with the brisk matter-of-fact respect she gave to anyone competent, which turned out to be exactly the right approach. Kale was less graceful about it. He had spent a lot of his life in rooms full of maps, which required patience and precision but not, particularly, the skill of existing alongside another person without inadvertently saying the wrong thing. He said the wrong thing several times in the first week. He asked about the Eastern Reach with genuine curiosity and no sense of how the question might land. He asked about the scars on her forearm and then immediately knew from the quality of her silence that he should not have. He tried to carry something for her once, reaching for the bundle before she'd indicated any interest in help, and had to step back sharply when she turned with a speed that was not quite a threat but was unmistakably a warning. He learned. He was, at the core of him, a person who paid attention, who noticed things and recorded them accurately, and what he recorded over those first weeks was this. Vraska was not dangerous the way a weapon is dangerous. She was dangerous the way a person is dangerous when they have been given every reason to believe that the world is hostile and no reason to believe otherwise. She was watching, always. She learned the sounds of the building, which stair creaked, where the door draft came from, what noise the cat made when it was startled versus when it was simply moving through a room. She learned the neighborhood, which vendors were trustworthy, which city guards had which patterns, where the exits were from any given street. She was, Kale slowly realized, doing exactly what she'd had to do to survive for however long it had been since the Eastern Reach. She was mapping the territory, just without paper. He thought about that. Then he got her paper. He left it on the table in the spare room one morning without comment. A good sheaf of it, survey weight, the kind that held lines well, along with a set of medium charcoal sticks. When he came back that afternoon, she was sitting at the table with the sheaf pushed aside and a single page in front of her, working in the charcoal with a focus so complete that she didn't hear him come in. He looked at what she was drawing. It was a map of the neighborhood around Brackett Lane, rendered from memory with a spatial accuracy that surprised him, the angles of intersections, the relative widths of streets, the placement of landmarks. It wasn't a cartographer's map. There was no surveying precision to the measurements, but the spatial intelligence behind it was evident. She had been building this map in her head, and now she was externalizing it. He backed out of the room quietly. That night at dinner, Essa looked at him across the soup pot and said, "She has a very good spatial memory." "I noticed," he said. "We could train that," Essa said. "I thought the same." He said, "You'd have to ask her." It has to be her choice. Essa looked at him with the expression she used when he'd said something that met her standards. Correct. She went back to her soup. Essa asked Vraska if she wanted to learn cartography. She framed it the way she framed all her practical questions, without performance or false warmth, simply as a matter of what was useful and what was not. You have a precise spatial memory and a systematic observational habit. Those are skills I can work with. I can teach you survey mathematics, symbol systems, and the conventions of representation. It would take roughly 2 years to full competency. If you're interested. Vraska looked at her for a long moment. What do you get from this arrangement? Competent surveyor. Eventually. And until eventually. 2 years of learning is not nothing. You'd be doing real work from the start. Vraska said, I want to be paid. Essa said, obviously. The wage negotiations took 20 minutes and resulted in terms that Kale, who had spent 3 years negotiating his own apprenticeship wage, could only describe as impressive. Vraska had apparently retained, through everything, a clear-eyed sense of her own value. So Vraska learned cartography. Kale watched this happen from the adjacent position of a fellow apprentice who was simultaneously trying not to crowd her space and trying not to be so uncrowding that she felt ignored, a balance he was not sure he always got right. What he could observe, from wherever he managed to position himself, was this. She learned with a ferocity that was almost physical. She applied to survey mathematics the same systematic intelligence she had applied to threat assessment. She memorized symbol systems the way she had memorized street layouts. She corrected Essa twice in the first month on questions of geometric proportion, and Essa, who did not tolerate fools but also genuinely respected being corrected accurately, simply noted the corrections and updated her standard practice. Essa told Kale privately, she's going to be better than you are eventually. Kale said, I know. I'm not bothered. Essa looked at him in a way that suggested she was revising her assessment of him slightly upward. What was harder to observe, because it happened in the spaces between the measurable things, was the way Vraska was slowly, cautiously, putting down the weight she'd mentioned on that first day. Not all at once. Not even consistently. There were days when something would happen, a sound from the street, a certain quality of light, a customer coming into the shop who moved in a particular way, and she would go back behind all her careful walls as completely as if she'd never left. But there were other days when she sat at the table in the studio working on a commission project and her shoulders were simply down, not as a conscious decision but as a natural fact, and the quality of her attention had something almost peaceful in it. He did not comment on this. He had learned, slowly, that commenting on the good days made her more aware of them, which made them harder to maintain. He simply noted them, privately, the way you note weather patterns that suggest a seasonal change. They started talking in the way that people in close quarters begin to talk, not in great deliberate conversations but in the accumulation of small ones. He learned that she had had a sister, younger, and that the sister's fate in the raid that had taken Vraska was unknown to her and had been unknown for 6 years, a fact she disclosed without effect and that he received in the same way, because he could see that effect was not what she needed. He learned that she had had a specific position in her clan's warrior structure, something that translated approximately as a scout interpreter, someone who moved ahead of a company into new territory and assessed it, which explained several things about how she moved through the world. She learned that his parents were both dead, that he had come to Essa's apprenticeship at 16 after a series of arrangements following their deaths that had not suited him and that he did not elaborate on. She did not push. She had her own unelaborated territories and she respected his. She learned that he collected coastal geography in the same way some people collected useless ornaments, for the pure pleasure of the accumulation, without any practical purpose. She discovered this because she found, on the third shelf from the bottom of the studio's east wall, 37 journals containing nothing but hand-copied coastal surveys from various secondary sources, organized by something that turned out to be a personal classification system he had developed at 14 and never explained to anyone. She asked about the system. He explained it. She listened with the focused attention she gave to things that actually interested her, which was different from the polite attention she gave to things she was simply enduring. This distinction, he was learning, was one of the most useful things to know about her. She said, when he finished, "This is a more elegant system than the one Essa uses for the main archive." He said, "Don't tell her that." A pause. Then, very quietly, Vraska made a sound that might have been the edge of a laugh. It was a small sound. He did not react to it because he had learned that reacting to the small sounds made them stop. But something in his chest did a complicated thing that he spent several days afterward pretending had not happened. The city, meanwhile, was not uncomplicated. Dusk's Landing was a port city, which meant it was theoretically accustomed to diversity, in the way that places which profit from international trade are theoretically accustomed to the people who conduct it. Theoretically. In practice, it was a city where orc people were present at the fringes, in labor, in the fighting pits, in the slave markets, and not in the map studios on Bracket Lane, or in the good-quality restaurants near the harbor, or in the parts of the market where precision instruments were sold. The first time Kale and Vraska went to the instrument district together to pick up a new surveying compass, 3 shop owners declined to let Vraska enter. 2 of them were rude about it. One of them was polite about it in a way that was somehow worse. Vraska handled all 3 interactions with a controlled flatness that he could see, now that he knew what to look for, was costing her something. He handled them badly. He got angry in a way that was not useful and then felt guilty about the anger and then felt guilty about the guilt because it was centering his own feelings in a situation that was not happening to him. Afterward, walking back to Bracket Lane with the compass they had eventually obtained from a 4th shop, whose owner turned out to have been married to an Orcish woman from the southern reaches and had opinions about the other 3 shop owners, Vraska said, "You don't have to perform outrage on my behalf." He said, "I know. I wasn't performing it." She looked at him sideways. He said, "I was just angry. I'm sorry if it wasn't helpful." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It was not unhelpful. It was simply—" She paused as though searching for the right word. "Surprising. Most humans are angry on their own behalf when things like this happen, because it is inconvenient for them." "You were angry on—" She stopped again. "On your behalf," he said. "Yes." Another pause. He did not fill it. He had gotten better at not filling pauses. She said, "That is a different thing." He said, "I know." They walked the rest of the way back to Bracket Lane without speaking, but the quality of the silence was different from the careful silences of the first weeks. It had something warmer in it, something that was beginning to be comfortable. There was a bracelet. He had noticed it in the first moments at the auction. A thick cuff of dark iron, almost black, worn on her right wrist. It was old, the surface worn smooth in the way that metal gets when it has been touched daily for years. She never removed it. In 6 months of living in the same building, he had never once seen her without it. He did not ask about it. He had a growing list of things he did not ask about, not because he was not curious but because he had learned with Vraska that there was a difference between things that were not said because the time was not right and things that were not said because they belonged to her and she would offer them if and when she chose. The bracelet, he thought, was the second kind. Then one evening in late autumn, he came into the studio after dinner to finish lettering a commission, and she was at the table working on her survey mathematics with a page of calculations spread before her, and the lamplight was at an angle he hadn't seen before, and he noticed something he had not noticed previously. The bracelet was not iron, or not entirely. There were marks on it, not decorative marks, not the kind of engraving that ornamented jewelry. Symbols. Small and carefully made, in the particular slightly too regular way of things inscribed by someone who had to work very hard not to have a trembling hand. She saw him looking. He looked away immediately. "Sorry." A pause. Then she said, "My mother made it." He was very still. She said, "In our clan, when a child reaches the age of testing, the trials of fitness, combat, endurance, their mother makes a cuff. The symbols are clan signs. Marks of belonging. It means you come from somewhere. You have people. When you go into the world and the world tries to make you nothing, you look at this and remember that you are something." He said, "She must have been remarkable." She was, Vraska said, and the 2 words had weight and he did not push for more. He said, "You've kept it through everything." She looked at the bracelet. "When they took everything else, they could not take this. I hid it. Different ways, different times. There were," she stopped, "moments where I almost lost it." She did not elaborate on what those moments had been. He did not ask her to. She looked at him. "It is the only thing from before that I still have." He thought about what that meant. To have lost everything from a before, and to have held on to one object through 6 years of being unmade by the world, and to still have it on your wrist in a strange city in a map shop on Bracket Lane. He said, "Then it must be one of the most important things in existence." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You are a strange person, Kale Morrow." He said, "I've been told that." She said, "I meant it as a description, not a criticism." He said, "I know." She looked at him for a moment with the amber-dark eyes that he had stopped trying to read and started trying simply to be honest in front of, because he had found that she responded better to honest than to interpreted. She said, "The symbols. Would you like to know what they mean?" He said, "Yes, very much." She told him, each symbol in order around the cuff. Some of them were clan marks, lineage, bloodline, the place of her family within the larger structure of Clan Urath. Some of them were her mother's words for her. The symbols that meant steady, and the one that meant eyes that see truly, and the one that, she said, with the ghost of something in her voice that he thought might be the memory of being loved, meant the one who will be difficult and worth it. He laughed, a small surprised laugh. She looked at him sharply. "Sorry," he said. That's a remarkably accurate symbol for you." She considered him. Then she said, "My mother knew me." "She did," he said. They sat like that for a while, the lamp between them, the survey mathematics temporarily forgotten, the commission lettering temporarily abandoned. It was the closest thing to comfortable silence that they had achieved. Not the silence of people avoiding each other's presence. The silence of people who have found a way to be in the same space without needing it to mean anything more than what it is. He thought, "I don't want to be anywhere else." He did not say this. The time for that was not now. But he noted it carefully, the way he noted things he wanted to remember accurately. He arrived in winter, when the streets of Dusk's Landing were cold and the harbor traffic had slowed to the minimal commerce of the gray months. His name was Darren Galder, and Kale recognized it from the auction placard, "Former owner, second of 3, before he recognized the man himself, because the man arrived at the door of S's shop in the manner of someone accustomed to his arrival being significant. He was perhaps 45, with the look of a man who had been prosperous for long enough that he had forgotten what it was like not to be. He wore good wool, a substantial ring, and the expression of someone conducting a straightforward errand. When Kale answered the door, Galder looked at him with the brief assessing glance. He might have given a piece of furniture. "I understand you purchased a property of mine," Galder said. Kale said nothing for a moment. He was very aware of the sounds of the building behind him, Essa in the studio, and somewhere above, the particular measured footfalls that were Vraska's. "I believe you mean a person," Kale said. Galder's expression shifted slightly, the way a man's expression shifts when he is used to setting the terms of an interaction and finds them challenged. "I've had some inquiries suggesting a female orc answering to a certain description is living in this building. I have reason to believe there are irregularities in the paperwork from the auction. She was sold to the Dusk's Landing market in violation of a prior agreement she was under to the Galder household. I'm here to correct that," Kale said. "The transfer documents were completed legally. I have them. Whatever prior arrangements you believe exist, they are superseded by the legal sale." Galder smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "You're a cartographer's apprentice. I'm a man with 4 lawyers and 30 years of successfully navigating legal disputes in this city. Do you honestly want to make this complicated?" Kale said, "Yes." He said this without particular heat, which seemed to disconcert Galder more than anger would have. He said, "I'd like you to leave now. If you want to pursue legal remedies, you're welcome to. My master's name is Essa Corder, and this shop is licensed under the Merchants Guild Charter, which has its own legal resources. I'd suggest you read the specific language of the Dusk's Landing slavery statutes regarding sale finality before you decide how complicated you want to make this." He knew the specific language of the statutes because Vraska had found them in Essa's legal reference archive 3 months ago and had read them systematically and had then provided him with an accurate summary. This was, he had been coming to realize, a recurring pattern. He thought he was taking care of her, and she was also and simultaneously making sure she knew exactly how to take care of herself. Galder's smile had not moved, but something behind it had. He said, "This isn't over." Kale said, "That may be. Good day." He closed the door. He stood in the entryway for a moment. His hands were not entirely steady. He was aware that what he had just done might not be sufficient, that Galder was almost certainly not a man who took no for a final answer, and that the comfortable relative peace of the last 6 months had just become complicated in a way that might not have easy resolution. Behind him, on the stairs, there were footsteps. He turned. Vraska was on the stairs, one hand on the railing, looking at him. Her face was very still. He could not tell how long she had been there. He said, "How much did you hear?" She said, "Enough." He said, "I don't know if that was sufficient. He may come back with legal instruments or—" "I know," she said. She came the rest of the way down the stairs. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen before. He had catalogued her expressions, the careful practiced versions and the real ones that broke through occasionally. But this one was new. Or not new. She had worn it when she told him about the bracelet, when she had offered him the symbols. It was the expression she had when she was deciding to give him something. She said, "When I was in the Galder household, I learned several things about Darren Galder." She paused. Some of those things are of a nature that, if they came to the attention of certain parties, would make Galder extremely reluctant to draw official scrutiny to himself. Cale said, "You've been holding that." "I have been holding many things," she said simply. He said, "You didn't need to tell me." "I know," she said. "But you just—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider her words. "Then you did not have to do what you did. At the door just now. That was not a requirement of your situation." He said, "Yes, it was." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "In my clan there is a concept. Vethurek. It means the person who stands between you and the wind. Not because you cannot face the wind, but because they choose to when they can." He said, "Vethurek." She said, "It is a serious concept. It is not given lightly." He said, "I see." She said, "You should know what I am calling you. In my language, when I think of what you are." He held that information carefully. He thought it was probably the most significant thing she had said to him. He said, "Thank you." She said, "We need a strategy for Galder." "Yes," he said, and felt something in him ease, the specific ease of being known accurately. "Yes, we do. What do you know about him?" They sat down together at the table in the studio, with Essa joining them shortly after, and they built the strategy the way they built survey maps. Systematically, precisely, leaving nothing important unmeasured. Galder did not come back. Spring came to Dusk's Landing with the particular insistence of a season that had been patient long enough. The harbor filled back up. The market expanded. The Festival of Trade, which happened every year at the first full moon of spring, and which the city's merchant class took with the seriousness of a religious observance, threw colored lanterns across every major street and filled the air with music from approximately 11 competing sources. Essa closed the shop for the day, on the grounds that she was 63 years old and had attended 42 Festival of Trades and did not need to attend a 43rd. Cale and Vraska went. This was not, precisely, a plan. Cale had been going to the festival since he was an apprentice, because certain rare navigation instruments appeared in the traveling stalls that you couldn't find the rest of the year, and the harbor stalls sometimes had old coastal charts from foreign surveying traditions that were genuinely interesting. He had mentioned this to Vraska not as an invitation, but as an explanation of where he was going. She had said, without any particular effect, "I'll come. The crowd patterns at a festival would be useful data." He had said, "Of course." And that was how it was. Two people with professional justifications walking into the festival market together on a spring evening, which was not a date in any sense that either of them had acknowledged. The city was different at festival. Noisier, more colorful, more itself. Even the complicated parts of it, the slave market district, was closed, by festival tradition, for the day, which meant the whole area was simply a street of shuttered businesses, and there was something quietly political about how much better the city smelled without it, were present but muted. The crowd was a mix of everyone. Merchants, sailors, servants, craftspeople. A striking cross-section of the city's various inhabitants. Vraska moved through it differently than she moved through the city on regular days. Her threat assessment was still running. He could see it in the way her eyes moved, but it was running at a lower register, like machinery that doesn't need full power. She was also, he noticed, actually looking at things. Not cataloging them. Looking at them. She stopped at a stall selling spiced nuts roasted in some foreign manner involving a lot of smoke and what smelled like star anise. She looked at the nuts. She looked at the vendor, who was a small man from somewhere far to the south, and said something to him in a language Cale did not recognize. The vendor's face transformed completely. He responded in the same language. They spoke for a few minutes, and Vraska bought a paper cone of the nuts, and when she turned back to Kale her expression had something in it that was neither assessed nor controlled. He said, "That language, what was it?" She said, "Trade tongue of the southern sea routes." She paused. "My mother knew it. She taught me. I have not spoken it in." She looked at the cone of nuts. "A long time." He said, "It sounded good. The speaking of it, I mean." She looked at him. Then, and this was a first, with no cue and no particular context beyond the festival evening and the spiced nuts and the sound of her mother's language in her own mouth, she smiled. Not the ghost of one. Not the controlled small adjustment of expression she permitted occasionally. An actual smile, the kind that changed the whole architecture of a face. He felt it somewhere behind his ribs. He said, "Here," and he offered his hand for one of the nuts, and she gave him one, and they walked on through the festival market eating from the same paper cone, and he thought, "I am very specifically not saying anything about this. Not because it does not matter. Because it matters a great deal, and I am not going to say the wrong thing at the wrong moment and ruin it." They found the navigation instruments. He showed her a sextant from a northern surveying tradition she hadn't encountered, and she immediately began reverse engineering its mechanics with the focused intensity she brought to anything genuinely interesting. The vendor, who had expected a straightforward sale, ended up having a 20-minute technical discussion with her about calibration methods that left him looking slightly overwhelmed. They found the old charts. She found one from the Eastern Reach, a copy of a copy, badly preserved, but unmistakably in the geographic notation system of the clan territories, and she went very still looking at it. He did not say anything. He bought it. He handed it to her without commentary. She held it for a long moment. Then she said, "This would be the coastal survey of the Urath territory's northern boundary." "I thought so," he said, though he had not known this. She said, "There is a harbor here." She pointed to a marking on the chart. "My clan's main harbor. My sister would have had to pass through it if she escaped after the raid." He said, "Is that something you think is possible? That she escaped?" Vraska said, "I do not know." She was very quiet. "But I would like to find out." He said, "There are ways to send inquiries through merchant networks. Long ways. Not reliable, but possible." She looked at him. Then she said very carefully, "You would help with that." He said, "I would help with that. Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that they had walked away from the chart stalls and were on the harbor side, where the festival lanterns were strung over the water and reflected in it, doubling themselves into a constellation at sea level. She said, "I have been thinking about something for some time now." He said, "What?" She said, "You bought my freedom. But I have been thinking that this is not actually what you did." She paused. "You did not give me freedom. I had to take that myself. The freedom was always mine. It was just constrained." She looked at the lanterns on the water. "What you did was see me. You stopped and you looked and you saw that there was a person in the cage and you made yourself responsible for that." She looked at him. "I have been trying to understand why." He said, "I think I looked at you and I couldn't look away. It wasn't rational." She said, "No, it wasn't." She was still watching him. "But I have been thinking that some things should not be rational. That the best decisions a person makes are sometimes the ones that come from somewhere below reason." He said, "You're paraphrasing something I said to myself the morning I made an extremely consequential decision." She said, "I know. I've thought about it many times." He said, "Vraska." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to say something now, and I need you to know that nothing about my behavior toward you depends on your answer. Nothing changes. I need to say it because I've been not saying it for 6 months, and I think not saying it any longer is going to require more effort than I have available." She was looking at him with the amber eyes, and her expression was the one he could not quite read but had stopped needing to read, because what he had learned was that he could simply be honest in front of it and trust that she would receive honesty accurately. He said, "I think you're the most remarkable person I've ever met, and I have been trying very carefully not to impose that on you, because you've had enough of people deciding things about you. But I think I am fairly certain that He stopped. "Try it again." He said, "I care about you. In a way that I don't care about other people. And I'm telling you because you deserve to know. Not because I need you to do anything about it. There was a long silence. Then Vraska said, in my clan, there is a word for the person who would stand in the cold so that you can be warm. The person who learns your language without being asked. The person who buys a chart of a country they've never been to because they see you go still when you look at it. She looked at the lanterns on the water. The word is not one I was permitted to use for a long time. She looked at him. But I have been using it in my own thoughts for several months. He said, what's the word? She said, Kethvara. It means the closest your language gets is the one who fits. But that is not quite right either. It means the person-shaped space inside you that only one person can fill. He said, he stopped. He said, you've been thinking of me that way. She said, for several months, yes. She tilted her head fractionally. Were you not aware? He said, I genuinely was not. I was trying so hard not to presume. She said, I noticed you trying. It was one of the reasons. She paused. That is perhaps the most honest sentence I have said to you. Because most people do not try. Most people simply take. He said, I don't want to take anything from you. She said, I know. She was quiet for a moment. That is why I am choosing to give. The lanterns moved on the water. The festival made its noise around them. They stood at the harbor in the spring evening, and she reached out and put her hand in his, and it was not a small thing, the weight of that choice. The weight of a person who has had every reason to keep her hands to herself deciding to extend one into someone else's space. And he held it carefully, the way you hold something that has been given to you honestly and that you intend to be worthy of. He said, Kethvara. She said, you pronounced it wrong. She squeezed his hand. But the meaning was correct. The letter came 8 months later, via the merchant network, through 3 intermediate carriers, in an envelope so worn that the original address was barely legible. It was addressed, in cramped, careful script, to Vraska of Clan Urath, care of any contact who can find her. Inside was a single page. The writing was different from the address, larger and less careful, the handwriting of someone who had not had much occasion to practice. But it was legible, and it was signed. Kale heard Vraska's footsteps on the stairs very early that morning, before the light was fully up, and he came down to find her sitting at the studio table with the letter in both hands and an expression he had only seen once before, at the harbor with the festival lanterns, when she had said things she had kept for months. He sat down across from her. He did not say anything. She said, my sister is alive. He said nothing because there was nothing to say, because the information had its own weight and gravity and needed a moment to exist in the room before words approached it. She said, she is in the Eastern Reach. She has been there since the raid. She paused. Separated from the fighting, she hid with a farming family. She eventually made her way back. She has been looking for word of me for 6 years. He said, how did she find you? The merchant network. She gave inquiries to every carrier who passed through. Eventually one of them knew someone who knew S's name and the connection to an orc woman in Dusk's Landing. He said, what do you want to do? She looked at him. She was very still, the way she was still when something mattered enormously and she was processing what to do with it. He had learned to recognize this stillness, to give it space. She said, she cannot come here. She has responsibilities in the Eastern Reach. The clan needs her. And she stopped. He said, you've been thinking about going back. She said, for some time. He said, okay. She looked at him sharply. He said, I mean, if you want to go back. To the Eastern Reach. To your sister, to your clan. That's a good thing. That's what should happen. She said, it is very far away. He said, I know. She said, the journey would take several months. He said, I know. She said, you have a life here. Your apprenticeship is nearly complete. You are going to be a very adequate cartographer in approximately 18 more months. He said, only adequate? She said, perhaps slightly better than adequate. She was watching him carefully. She said, I am not going to ask you to give anything up. He said, Vraska, when have I ever made a decision because someone asked me to? She looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression, the release of something she had been holding carefully. She said, there are parts of the Eastern Reach that have never been accurately surveyed. He said, is that so? She said, The coastal geography in particular is almost entirely undocumented in any tradition outside the clan's own records. He said, "That sounds like a significant cartographic opportunity." She said, "It would require someone with strong survey mathematics and a good professional reputation to establish credibility with the local authorities." He said, "I happen to know someone who fits that description." She said, "You are going to be insufferable about this." He said, "Probably." He looked at her. He said, "Kethvara goes where her person is, I'd imagine." She looked at him for a long time. Something in her face did the thing it did, occasionally, when she let the carefully maintained surface go entirely, when she simply was what she was without any management. He loved that. He had loved it quietly and without declaration for months, and he thought he would probably love it in exactly this way for the rest of his life. She said, "You really are a strange person, Kale Morrow." He said, "You've mentioned that." She said, "I am saying it again because I mean it differently now." He said, "How so?" She said, "Now I mean it as the highest possible praise." He said, "I'll take it." She stood up and he stood up, and she was several inches taller than him even in the plain morning light of the studio, and she put her arms around him with the deliberate precision she put into everything that mattered to her, and he held on. Outside, Dusk's landing was waking up. The harbor sounds were starting, ropes and pulleys and the distant percussion of dock work, the voices of sailors, the particular salt and tar smell of the sea coming in through the cracked window. Somewhere below, S's cat was being loud about its breakfast. The letter sat on the table. Evidence of a sister alive and a future that had opened where 6 months ago there was a wall. He said into her shoulder, "When do we leave?" She said, "We should prepare properly. Plan the route. Arrange passage. It would be irresponsible to leave before spring." He said, "Of course." She said, "For months, perhaps. If we are efficient." He said, "We can be efficient." She said, "Yes." She did not let go. "We can." They left in the first week of spring, when the routes north were passable and the shipping lanes had opened and Essa had finished the commission that needed finishing before she could reasonably let them go. The departure was the kind that accumulates in layers because there is always one more thing, one more essential errand, one more conversation that needs to have before you can actually leave, until you realize that the leaving has been happening for weeks and the actual physical act of stepping out the door is almost anticlimactic. Essa stood in the doorway of the shop on Brackett Lane and looked at them with the expression she wore when she was about to say something practical that was also sentimental and was managing the sentimentality carefully. She said, "To Kale, you have the survey instruments." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the letter of professional introduction I wrote." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you've memorized the Northern Coastal Notation System so you don't embarrass me in front of whichever tradition you encounter." He said, "I've memorized it." She said, "Good." Then she looked at Vraska. She said, "Your spatial mathematics are better than his. Make sure he knows when to defer to you." Vraska said, "He already does." Essa said, "Good man." She looked between them. "You're going to do this right. I know that." She did not elaborate on what right meant. She did not need to. She had been watching them do it for over a year and they all knew what she meant. She said, "Write when you find something interesting to document." Vraska said, "We will find many things." Essa said, "I know. That's why I said write when you find something interesting. I don't have all day." She went back inside. The cat watched from the window. They walked to the harbor. The ship that would take them north and then east was a cargo vessel, the Thornback, which traded in raw materials and had a captain named Saravol who was a former navigator turned merchant who had strong opinions about route planning and no opinions whatsoever about her passengers' origins or appearances. She had met Vraska at the booking and said, "You're tall," and Vraska had said, "Yes," and Saravol had said, "Going to be a problem on the lower deck, we'll put you in the upper berth," and that had been the entirety of it. It was, Kale thought, a model of efficiency. The journey took 3 months with 2 ports of call for resupply. During those 3 months, certain things happened. They developed, collectively and without discussion, a system for navigating the ship's limited space. He took the port side of any shared space. She took the starboard. He woke early. She stayed up late. They overlapped in the middle hours and shared meals and worked on the preliminary documentation they were planning for the Eastern Reach surveys. Bent over the folding table in the upper berth with the lamp between them and the sound of the sea around the hull. He learned, in the enforced proximity of a ship, the difference between Vraska's various silences. He could distinguish now between the silence of threat assessment and the silence of active thought and the silence of contentment and the rarer silence of something she was working up to saying. He had gotten much better at simply sitting in the last one without trying to fill it. She learned, in the enforced proximity of a ship, that he talked in his sleep. She told him this without any particular effect, and he was profoundly embarrassed, and she said, "It's not anything important. Mostly coordinates and what sounded like you arguing with someone about a cartographic convention." He said, "That sounds exactly right." She said, "I don't mind it." Then she went back to her work as though this declaration was entirely ordinary. They passed through a storm in the second month, a genuine storm, the kind where the ship moves in ways that suggest physics is taking suggestions rather than directions. He was seasick. This was not heroic. She was not seasick at all, having apparently the kind of inner ear that found ship motion unremarkable, and she brought him water and sat with him through the worst of it with the focused practical care she brought to things that needed doing regardless of how they appeared. He said, during a brief interval of improvement, "You don't have to," she said, "I know." She handed him the water. "Drink this." He drank it. He said, "This is undignified." She said, "I've seen you talk to a city guard for 20 minutes without raising your voice to preserve my legal standing in this city. We are past the point where I have any concerns about your dignity." He considered this. Then he drank more water. In the third month, as they approached the eastern waters and the landscape began to change, the coast taking on a different character, greener and steeper and less settled, the air carrying something that Vraska said, very quietly, was the smell of home. She stood at the rail and looked at it for a long time. He stood beside her. She said, "I was not sure, when we left, that I believed this was real." She paused. 6 years is long enough to forget how to believe in things. He said, "But," she said, "but there it is. The coast." Her voice had changed. Very slightly. It had the quality of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and was now being permitted, carefully, to release. She said, "My mother brought me to the coast when I was young, to teach me the tidal notation. We sat on the northern cliff for a full day and she showed me how to read the water. How to know what the sea was doing by the color and the pattern and the way the birds moved." She looked at the coastline. "I have not been back since the raid." He said, "What does it feel like?" She said, "Larger than I remembered." She was quiet. "And exactly right." He said, "We'll find good cliff access for the survey. The northern cliffs would be the best elevation for coastal mapping." She looked at him. Her expression was the one he called the real one, the one below all the others. She said, "You are doing it again." He said, "What?" She said, "Saying the right thing without knowing you're saying it." She reached over and took his hand. The bracelet was cool against his wrist. The dark iron with its symbols of clan and belonging and the one who will be difficult and worth it. The smell of home was stronger now, salt and green and ancient stone. Her sister was somewhere in the territory ahead, alive, waiting. He said, "We should probably start noting the coastal features." "Professional habit," she said. In a moment, she did not let go of his hand. He did not reach for his notebook. Some things, he had learned, could be accurately documented later. There is a cartographic tradition in the Eastern Reach, among Clan Urath and 3 neighboring clans, of noting the names of the surveyors on the face of the chart rather than in the administrative records. The reasoning, Vraska's sister explained when she met them at the clan's northern harbor with the directness of a woman who has spent 6 years figuring out what matters, is that a map should acknowledge its makers. A map is not an objective record of the land. It is a document of all the people who looked at the land and tried to understand it. Their names belong on the face of it. The first chart produced by the Urath Coastal Survey Project, begun in the spring of that year, jointly commissioned by Clan Urath and the Cartographers Guild of Dusk's landing in an arrangement that took longer to negotiate than the survey itself, listed 2 surveyors on its face. The first name was in the common tongue, Kale Morrow, cartographer. The second was in the clan notation system, in Vraska's own precise hand, with a translation provided below in common, Vraska of Clan Urath, survey interpreter and principal surveyor. Below both names, in smaller script, was a single additional notation. It was in the clan language, and the translation was Vraska's, and she had chosen the words carefully. These maps were made by people who chose to see the land as it is, not as others told them it must be. The surveying took 4 years. During those 4 years, they mapped 1,100 kilometers of previously undocumented coastline, contributed 17 new notations to the professional cartographic literature, and established a methodology for cross-traditional survey practice that Essa Corder, reading their reports in her shop on Brackett Lane with her cat on her lap, described in a letter back to them as genuinely impressive, which from Essa was approximately equivalent to anyone else saying extraordinary. During those 4 years, other things happened also. Vraska's sister, whose name was Darath and who had the family's spatial intelligence combined with a directness that made Vraska seem reserved, decided that Kale was probably acceptable within the first 3 days of meeting him and told him so in those exact words. He thanked her. She said he was welcome. They got along thereafter with the mutual respect of two people who each had strong opinions about the correct person to be protective of. The bracelet's symbols were, at Vraska's request, documented by Kale in the survey records. Not as cartographic information, but as historical notation. The record he made was meticulous. Every symbol, its meaning, its placement on the cuff, its relationship to the surrounding marks, the way the metal had worn with years of wear. He made a fair copy on good paper and gave it to her. She gave the copy to Darath to keep, in case, she said simply, and because some things should exist in more than one place. Kale's spatial mathematics improved significantly over the 4 years, primarily because Vraska corrected him often and without mercy, and he received correction without defensive reaction, and they had developed, over considerable time, the specific productive dynamic of two people who care enough about each other to be honest and competent enough about their work to have something worth being honest about. They were married at the northern harbor, with the eastern sea behind them and Darath as official clan witness, and a ceremony that was partly in the common tongue and partly in the clan language and partly in the trade tongue of the southern sea routes, which Vraska had been teaching Kale for 2 years and which he spoke competently if imperfectly. He said the words he needed to say imperfectly but accurately, which she told him afterward was the correct approach. He said he'd been aiming for that. She said she knew. The ceremony included, at his suggestion and her approval, the exchange of a small cartographic document. Not a ring, because that was not the tradition, and because they had already exchanged something more significant, which was the particular daily act of showing up honestly in each other's presence over years, but a document, a chart of the first piece of coastline they had surveyed together, the northern cliff where her mother had taught her to read the water. His surveying. Her symbols in the notation system she had been born knowing. Both their names on the face of it. Some years after, when the Urath Coastal Survey was complete and the collection was archived with both the clan records and the Cartographers Guild, a young cartographer from the capital asked about the collection's origin. She had been assigned to catalog it and had noticed the unusual cross-traditional methodology and the notation style that combined two distinct geographic traditions in a way she had not seen before. She was told the story by Darath, who told it the way she told all important things. Directly, without embellishment, starting from the facts and proceeding to the meaning. The cartographer said, "And they're still working together?" Darath said, "They are surveying the interior territories now. We have not seen them for 3 months. We expect a letter when they find something interesting to document." The cartographer said, "That sounds like a remarkable partnership." Darath looked at her with the amber eyes that were the family's most consistent feature and said, "It is not a partnership. It is a Kethvara." The cartographer said, "I don't know that word." Darath said, "The person-shaped space inside you that only one person can fill." She began walking back toward the archive. "Add it to the glossary. It should be on record." The cartographer wrote it down. "It is on record. Somewhere, in the interior territories, there is a cliff above an unmapped river valley, and on that cliff there are two people who should not by any reasonable accounting have found each other, bent over a survey table as the light changes, arguing with professional precision about a cartographic notation and occasionally stopping to look at the view, which is genuinely extraordinary, and which they will document accurately when they have finished looking at it. The maps they make are the best available record of where things are. The story of how they came to be there, a wrong turn in the rain, a cage door, a set of charts sold at 3 times their value, a language spoken again after years of silence, a bracelet with symbols that mean I come from somewhere and you are mine and I am choosing this is not on any map. But it is, in all the ways that matter, exactly as real.